Shir is dedicated Le'ila Nishmas Rachelea Bas Rav Chaim Tzvi. We spent many weeks, many shiurim discussing the topic of Bishul, and we discussed the topic of Shehiyah. We've discussed the topic of Chazara, and what we'd like to do today is to really kind of put it all together and get into a lot of halach l'maisa issues. We'll start with going through Chazara, because that's going to be the most relevant in building our building blocks, and then discuss a lot of the halach l'maisa applications. So we pointed out that it is also Nisa D'Rabbanan to take fully cooked food and put it on the fire Nesina lechatchila on Shabbos. That's going to be us. Even if it's fully cooked, it's not going to be Nisa D'Oraisa because Ein Bishul Achar Bishul. But Midrabbanan Chazal were goes there for one of two reasons not to put food back on a fire, either because Shema Yachata Bigacholin, you might come to stoke the coals, or because in Nisa D'Rabbanan it's Mechzik Mavashel, what we discussed in the last year, it's a Malacha Midrabbanan. However, Chazal did say that if you satisfy each of 5 different requirements, then it's not called Nesina Lechatchila anymore. It's not putting it down. It's rather called Chazara, just a mere returning of the food to the fire, and that is going to be Mutter Lechatchila. And we've already discussed those 5 requirements, which are, number 1, you can't put it directly on the fire. You need Garo Fukatum, you need a blech. That's the first requirement. And that really solved the problem of Shema Yachat B'Gecholim. By having a blech, you're not going to come to stoke the coals. A second requirement is that the food, in order to be put back on the fire, obviously must be mavushal called tzorcho. That's the Shitas HaRambam, which says that if you have food, even if it's already cooked kamaychal ben soy, but it's not mavushal called tzorcho, and you put it back on the fire to become cooked, that's going to be an Isser D'Oraisa of Bishul. So because of that Isser, you certainly have to have the food to be mavushal called tzorcho. The third requirement, which we're going to have to discuss, is the requirement of lo nitztan lagamre. In order to go ahead and put the food back on the fire, the food still has to be warm. If it's cooled down, if it's no longer eaten machmas chamim mimuso, if it's not eaten in a warm state, in its current state, which is warm, meaning it's cooled down, even higher than room temperature, but you don't no longer have that warm feeling in that food, so that's going to be usher to return the food to the fire. We'll explain why in a second. Fourth and fifth requirement, the really package requirement, go together. You need da'at lahag. So when you took it off the fire, you have to have da'as to put it back on the fire, and you need odo biyodo. The food had to have been continuously in your hand. You can't have put it down and then in order to put it back in the fire, it has to be in your hand the entire time. Those are the 5 requirements. Now our agenda in today's shir is identify and really understand why is there any way we can go ahead and have warm food on Shabbos day, other than, of course, putting food up before Shabbos to just on a slow cooker to keep it on all Shabbos long in order to have warm food, warm cholent on Shabbos day. Is there any way we can go ahead and take food from the refrigerator that is cooled down, that's been sitting overnight in the fridge, and put it back on a heat source on Shabbos in order to have warm food on Shabbos? That's our practical agenda, to find out the ways in which we can do so, if we're allowed to do so. And at first blush, we seem to have a major problem because of those 5 requirements. So good. A couple of them are not going to be problems. If you put it on a blech, we solve the problem of garuf cotton. Let's assume the food is fully cooked. That's not going to be an issue. Let's assume when you took it off the fire, that's not going to be such an issue. But the issue of lo nitztan lagamre and odo biyado, those are going to be serious issues. After all, if this food is in the refrigerator, so it's certainly when you took it off the fire, it's not odo biyado anymore, and therefore that's going to be a problem. The second problem that you're going to have is lo nitztan lagamre. By putting the refrigerator, it's fully cooled down, and once it's fully cooled down, how do you go ahead and put it back on the fire? That's going to be a serious issue, and that's going to require some analysis of these 2 requirements in greater detail. Let's start with that third requirement of lo nitztan lagamre. This is enunciated very clearly in the Shulchan Aruch, Reish Nun Gimel, Halacha Beis, and the truth is, it is kedai, just as a matter of review, to read this whole sif. It's a long sif, but let's read it together just to get reviewed. If you have it, open up Reish Nun Gimel Halacha Beis. The Shulchan Aruch tells us, Kira shehi grufo ktuma. You have a kira, that is garuf katan, you have a blech. V'notal hakader me'aleh, you pull the kedera off. Even on Shabbos, mutter lahachzira, you can put it back on the blech, so long as kozman shiro tachas. First of all, the food must be hot. Lo nitztan lagamre, it has to still be hot, rotachas. And if it has cooled down, you cannot put it back on the blech. So that's requirement, what we're calling requirement number 3. Then the Ramah adds va'oda biyado. You have to have it still in your hands. Shulchan Aruch says v'lo nichal gabe karka. If you put it down on the ground, no good. It has to be in your hands. That's the second requirement. The Rama adds v'dat al hachzir, and you have to have das to put it back. That's our third requirement. We already assumed gar v'katan. That's already brought up initially, and those are 4 out of the 5 requirements. And the obvious requirement of muvushal called sarko, the Rama mentions one sentence later, v'daf kashataf shel muvushal called sarko, az mutar lachzira, then you're allowed to go ahead and put it down. But if you're missing any of these requirements, it sounds like it's going to be asur. That's the basic halacha. Now again, we'll get into more details in a moment. But let's discuss that third requirement, lo nitztani lagamre. Why is it necessary that the food not have cooled down? What exactly is the reason for this? And there are basically 2 approaches in the poskim to understand why you have this requirement of lo nitztani lagamre. One way to look at it, and this is the view of the Magen Avraham, and this will call the dominant view in later poskim, the Magen Avraham, is that you look at requirements 3